From one of the premier diplomats, U.S. diplomats, George Kennan, who in 1977 said the following, quote, our nation's actions in the field of foreign affairs are the convulsive reactions of politicians to internal political life dominated by vocal minorities. Right? And I think that Kennan actually knew what he was talking about, and so I've made a study of how this could be and why this came about, and so I'd like to discuss that issue. I think we start with the premise that Americans pay little attention to foreign policy, all right? And it's safe to say that not only do they pay little attention to foreign policy, but they don't know how it's made, and they don't care, right? Actually, this is not particularly unusual. Most people spend their lives in essentially in local environments, and that's where their attention lies. It's in local environments that we have our families, our peers, it's where we gain our sustenance, we have our jobs, okay? So the majority of people, not only in the United States, but across the globe, pay attention to their local environments, and we can almost see this as a Darwinian kind of perspective. If you're most familiar with your local environment, it has survival value. But the flip side of this is that you pay less attention, or no attention at all sometimes, to what's going on over the next proverbial hill, okay? So, and it's also the case that it's easier to spot lies and misrepresentations about your local environment than about some foreign environment. So if I came along and I told you, oh, I don't know, I mean, say, let's allege that, or let's assume that we're all from Washington, D.C., and I came along and I said, well, you know, there's, tomorrow there's going to be this movement, this attack from Alexandria, Virginia, and the Alexandrian Virginians are going to take over the White House, and so you would kind of say, well, this guy's out to lunch. I mean, you know, you really should be put in a padded cell or something like that. You would know that that was completely preposterous. But if I told you something about what's going on in Uzbekistan or something like that, what would you know? So the flip side of it is that this natural localism essentially creates, usually for the majority, a certain ignorance about what's outside the local area, okay? And it's not paid attention to. That ignorance is not paid attention to until a moment of crisis comes. And when a crisis comes, then a lot of people discover their ignorance, and they look for information. And where do they turn? Where do they get the information? Well, they get it from local media, who draws on government sources of information, produces experts, so-called experts, and they get it from the newspapers, they get it from rumor, generated from their peer group, or what have you, okay? They get it from sources of information that may or may not know what they're talking about, okay? But the locals aren't going to be able to discern whether in fact the experts know what they're talking about or not. They have no basis to contextualize the issue and to make the judgment, okay? All right, so we have a situation where, at least I assert, that most Americans pay little attention to foreign policy. And I would add to this that among the Americans, there is a certain general sense of political powerlessness. Okay? I think this is why in the best of times, many high percentages of Americans don't vote in national elections. Okay? It's strange. I mean, they don't. Americans tend not to vote in very local elections. The school boards, it's hard to get people to come out unless they've got kids in 5th grade. It's very hard to get people to turn out for local elections like that, and it's hard to get people to turn out for national elections. Okay? I'm not exactly sure why that is, but I mean, the local elections is a sort of a mystery to me. But anyway, there's a general sense of powerlessness. Okay? A sizable portion of the population regularly fails to vote in national elections. Okay, so if we put together this sense of powerlessness with a general ignorance and disregard for foreign policy, we have to ask the question, who's running the show? Okay? What kind of a democracy is the United States when most of its folks essentially pay no attention to serious policy making and don't vote in national elections? My contention is that the United States is not a democracy of individuals, at least in practice. Okay? What it is it's a democracy of competing interest groups. Essentially, into the fact that there's great power and great influence that can be achieved if you can approach the government in the proper way. So what these people do, and there's a lot of this, what these people do is they pool together, they organize folks with common interests. Okay? So if you're a teacher, you belong to the various national teachers unions. If you're a person over 60 or 55 or whatever, you join this American Association of Retired People. And if you simply have this obsessive love of pistols and AK-47s and M16s, you join the NRA. Okay? So essentially what we have is, in order to get around this issue of powerlessness and around the issue of sort of popular disregard for policy making, part of which is this ignorance of foreign policy, what you do is you have these groups taking advantage of the vacuum, forming themselves into interest groups, and then pooling their money, pooling, in some cases, their voting power, like retired people, and approaching the government that way as an interest group. All right? So it's not individuals who, or it's not even constituents a lot of times, who will influence policy making. It is these groups. They're the ones who supply a lot of the money for campaigning, and if they're very slick at it and they're very good at it, they're going to have major influence on policy formulation on issues that they particularly have interest in. All right? Now, I mentioned that the issue of constituents. It seems to me that when a politician is running for office, his constituency at that moment is the pool of people who will vote for him. And the job of his campaign manager and folks who work for him is to essentially address that constituency and make sure they, in fact, vote for him. Make the alliances that you need with other constituencies, build a coalition, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? What happens after you're elected? Who's your constituency then? Well, actually, I think it changes. I think the constituencies is no longer the folks back home, except in a very sort of offhanded, marginal way. And now the constituency is a mixture of interest groups, okay, that might actually operate somehow in your state, or have some sort of deal they want to make in exchange for their money for your vote, or something like that, and the party. You orient your ambitions and your behavior to the interests of the political party you belong to, okay? In any case, this sort of scenario where interest groups sort of take the place of your popular constituency, this kind of thing operates in an obvious fashion in domestic affairs all the time, okay? And I mentioned a few of the more powerful interest groups. It also happens in terms of foreign policy. The fact that you have a large popular disregard for foreign policy means there's a vacuum, a large vacuum, and that vacuum is filled by interest groups who approach the government and essentially exchange their power. Sometimes it's voting power, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's both, for votes on specific foreign policy issues that their group is interested in. All right? And this, of course, calls into question the issue of national interest. Is there such a thing as national interest? Or are there parochial interests of these interest groups, which are then passed on in the media to the population as national interests? Okay? So that's a really important question. The president, have to keep in mind that the president, whether it's, well, let's put it this way. Usually, the president is a political animal, so are the Congress folks, okay? And policy is going to be formulated in terms of politics, and politics is essentially influenced by lobbies, okay? How about the media? So you can ask yourself, okay, well, if we've got this sort of skewed scenario, why doesn't the media pay attention to this? Why isn't it a big scandal? And this sort of thing. After all, we don't have a censored media. Well, the government doesn't censor the media, but the media censors the media. It's a self-censoring kind of proposition. And again, it kind of flows kind of naturally. What you've got is you've got profit-oriented corporations who run these things. Sometimes the owners are single families or single people who have a strong ideological kind of crusading orientation, right? And sometimes you just have people who they want to make sure that their investment is profitable. And so how do you work that? Well, one of the things you don't do is take controversial stands that might chase away advertisers or subscribers, okay? So there's a natural kind of tendency on the part of ABC, NBC, CBS, I won't even mention Fox, or Murdoch's operation, or those are the ideologues. There's a natural tendency on the part of these media operations to essentially find a middle ground, find a something that's not going to upset or the public view, the popular public view, to just sort of support the status quo. And also, I think that you're going to find that the editors and the owners of these folks, of these media outlets, are themselves products of this information environment that essentially has a sort of point of view that has narrow parameters. And those parameters have been formed over time in a customary fashion to think about the United States and its orientation in the world in a certain kind of way, right? Okay, so we can't really rely, I think, on the media to break through this sort of lobby defined interest group kind of motivated policy formulation process. By the way, Noam Chomsky wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent that kind of describes how this happens. So the result is that we actually live in a closed information environment while having a, quote, free press, unquote. Okay? And again, it's not unique to the United States. I think most societies, even though they might be, free world societies, operate in this kind of fashion. Okay? All right. So when it comes to certain issues that strong lobby groups have an interest in, their parochial interests start to substitute for national interests. And I'll just give you a couple examples of this, all right? And just to stay away from, at least initially, from the super duper controversial one, just take Cuba. Okay? So for 50 years, the United States has devoted all kinds of sanctions and vilification and stuff to this island as if it was about to invade Miami. And actually it did invade Miami by sending all these immigrants to Miami. But I mean, the government of Cuba, the Castro regime, was never, ever a real threat to the United States, while the United States was, of course, an enormous threat to Cuba. And it's the Bay of Pigs fiasco that probably strongly led the Cubans to accept missiles from Russia, and we know where that went. Okay? But in the American mind, in the American media, the American government behavior, it's Castro and his regime that are sort of somewhere this side of hell. Why? It really wasn't a national security issue. It is the function of the power and influence of a very strong lobby, right? And their voting power and their money to shape foreign policy. That's what it was. So it's skewed. And so being anti-Castro becomes a national interest of the United States, which made no sense whatsoever. I think the same thing happens in the Middle East. The same thing happens with Israel and our support of Israel against the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. What is it? Is it in the US national interest, in any rational sense, to alienate billions and billions of Muslims, hundreds of millions of Arabs, to make a large portion of the globe think negatively about the United States? That's not in the national interest. It is in the interest of a particular, very powerful, very, very organized interest group. Okay? And that's how our democracy works. So what's the consequences of this? Well, the consequences of this, at least in terms of the Middle East, is that for over 60 years, the US has pursued policies that have increasingly alienated much of the population of that region. And I'm not just talking about Muslims. I mean, you just get yourself a Christian cab driver, in Egypt, and listen to him. Okay? Okay. All right. I'm essentially done. Okay, so I won't meander on. The consequences of this are a skewed foreign policy formulation process that bodes very, very ill for the United States in terms of the Middle East. Okay.
Okay.
I'll manually do it.
Okay, so I will try to make it short as well, probably like around 15 minutes. So the study is about Egypt after the revolution. So it's about the lessons, both the theoretical lessons from the revolution and the empirical lesson about Egypt as a case study. Can you check? So basically, we have three main questions with regard to this subject. So the first question is about, there was a long-term debate between democracy and Islamic militancy. One of the debates raised after 9/11 was saying basically whether Islamist violence was caused by the presence of oppressive regimes in the region, or was it caused by other factors. For example, socioeconomic disruptions of societies, the role of ideologies, the role of radical organizations, the role of cults, and so on. No, again before. So, with the change of regime in Egypt and in other countries, now we have to understand the implications of this debate for those regimes. Basically, it means that if the absence of democracy was responsible for Islamist violence, then the demise of these regimes will eventually lead to the disappearance of violence and to the disappearance of Islamic violence by some militant armed groups. If not, then violence will probably take another form. And then the third implications about Al Qaeda and that kind of and this intellectual and military trend in the region. So, why Egypt? Because mainly Egypt has been a central country in the case of Islamic militancy. Two of the main Islamic groups were created in Egypt. So Al-Jama'ah Islamiyah, the Islamic group, and Jamaat al-Jihad, the Jihad group. They were created for different reasons, different periods. The Jihad group was created so as to topple the state through military coup and then impose an Islamic state in the region. Then some of them split it, created another organization, and joined Al-Qaeda with bin Laden in Afghanistan. The Islamic group, on the other hand, was created as a politicizing organization which intended to create an Islamic society in Egypt. Later, they adopted violence as a reaction to state policies. During the revolution, both groups were, as we are going to see, quite divided. Nevertheless, after the revolution, some of them created political parties, some of them were divided, and so we are going to understand the consequences for the region. Okay, no, before.
This one?
Yeah, no, before. After? Okay. So the January uprising in 2011, so it started as something unrelated to Islamic movements. So that I'm not going to elaborate on this topic itself. So basically it started as a protest against the police, then that became bigger and bigger. Huge demonstrations organized all around the country, uniting millions of Egyptians, and that led then to the demise of the Egyptian president and to the partial change of regime in Egypt. Briefly, I'm going to focus then in the next part on the position of Islamic militant groups. But first of all, about the Islamic trend, there was a quite contentious debate about that. Some of them blamed them for refusing the revolution and then for somehow stealing it because they won in the elections. While actually it's not as true and as simplistic as it has sometimes been perceived. So first of all, for the Muslim Brotherhood, so briefly, they didn't want to be involved in the revolution. Not only the group was divided, but also because they didn't want to be seen as the main responsible and the main actor behind the revolution. That could have led them to a huge wage of repression in case of failure of the revolution to achieve anything. Then Salafi preachers, so like this literary trend in Islam, their main position was against it. So usually they would have they said that they preferred an oppressive leader that was somehow Muslim than fitna and chaos in the society. Then other Salafis were like more radical and more militant, decided nevertheless to support the uprising. And then to finish, religious institutions, at the beginning they opposed the revolution, they said what to support the regime, and then they supported the uprising when the uprising led to some changes. So now we're going to see the positions of the two militant groups in Egypt. So what were their positions before the revolution? What were their position on the revolution? And what occurred later on? So first, before the revolution, the Islamic group was historically the biggest movement in Egypt. So Al-Jama'a Islamiyah emerged in the late 70s, then expanded by the late 70s in Egyptian universities in the south, then they expanded in Cairo as well, and then they were associated to the other group, Jamaat al-Jihad, and committed the assassination of Sadat in 81. Later on, a huge wave of repression led to a division of the movement. So just before the revolution, some of them were in prison still, some of their military leaders, some of them were still fighting in Afghanistan, and Pakistan with other militant groups there, and others have been freed after 2006. So those were organization divisions and geographic divisions, but they were also divided on ideology and on the intellectual trend. So some of them revised their previous ideologies. So two of the main leaders said that what happened in the past, in 70s, 80s, many use of violence was actually wrong, and that they shouldn't have used violence against the state in this one faced by oppression. Others still said that their previous ideas were actually valid, and only some limited use of violence were to be condemned and were to be retreated on. So those two divisions meant that they didn't have a common position about on the uprising in 2011. So some of its historical leaders who led the ideological revisions whereby they announced former ideas said that they had to accommodate the regime and oppose the uprising. Other leaders who are still in jail and other leaders who are outside supported it from the beginning. So then the second group, the jihad group, there's never been a coherent organization. There have always been some cells in Egypt, abroad, and so on. They didn't have real connections with one another. So the decision making was always led to some individual leaders in jail, in Egypt and abroad. So consequently, they were divided not only on ideas, because they didn't have the same ideas on strategy and on tactics, on the long-term tactic to adopt in Egypt, but they were also divided geographically. So some of them were still in jail at the time of the revolution, some of them were in Egypt, free, and some of them were outside. So there was no decision making. There was no common decision that could be taken by the group. So here again, similarly to what happened with the Islamic group, there was not one common position on the revolution and not one official support. Then we're going to see five main developments that occurred after the revolution, and then evaluate their impact for Egypt, but also for the region, and also in case of the theory about the general question about democracy and Islamist violence. So the first one, that thousands and thousands of prisoners have been freed by the authorities. First by the military authorities in Cairo, later by Mohammed Morsi. But all of that covered both groups and also unaffiliated individuals. The second one was the emergence of ex-jihadi political parties. So both movements created their own political party, and both of them tried to participate to the elections to some extent, with success for the Islamic group and not for the other one. We're going to see the reasons later on. Then further development. So first, some people refused the democratization of the region, the democratization of Egypt as a regime, created their own trend called the Salafi Jihadi trend, refusing democratic elections, refusing the political process, and putting violence elsewhere, but not putting violence in Egypt itself. Then one of the other developments was violence in Sinai. So some militant groups were created in Sinai and used violence against the state, against state representatives, and against what represented, according to them, the previous regime. Then we're going to see the last development was the impact of the armed conflict in Syria on Cairo, on Egypt itself. So first, the liberation of prisoners covered thousands and thousands of prisoners. So people from the Islamic group, political leaders, military leaders have been freed progressively. People from the jihad group, the same thing. So they covered from leaders to field soldiers. So they covered both people who were jailed in 81 for the action of Anwar Sadat, to people who were involved in supporting Al-Qaeda-related groups by the late 90s. So several members were quite symbolic, like Abu Zuma and so on participated in the action of Sadat, to Muhammad Zawahiri was with the brother, the leader of Al-Qaeda right now. So that was a controversy for Pundit because they said that those prisoners could potentially then be involved in action of violence. So political parties. First, the Islamic group created its own political party, Hizb al-Bin al-Wataniya, so the Development and Construction Party, who participated in the elections. So they said that they still believe in the same ideas, imposing Islam as a state religion, or imposing Islamic law in Egypt through the parliament. So all the group accepted this idea, and all the group accepted the legitimacy of the political process. The Jihad group, on the other hand, some individuals decided to form their own political party, but they didn't manage to reach a consensus among former members and leaders of the movement. So only some of them joined it, and then they failed to actually unite on a common political platform. So then the Salafi Jihadi trend basically united people who were part of the Jihad group before, who refused the political process altogether, who refused to accept that we could reach an Islamic state through democracy in Egypt. So they activated their new networks in Cairo, mainly organized demonstrations to apply Islamic law, and organized some demonstrations in support of violence elsewhere, mainly in Syria. So there are a very marginal, those are marginal figures. They are quite important on the internet and on rated media. That doesn't represent the actual force in Egypt and the Egyptian society. They represent only a few tiny individuals, and then they managed to conglomerate around them some thousands of young supporters who were unrelated to militant groups before, but who joined them because they did accept the ideas through online circulation on the internet. So violence in Sinai, that's totally unrelated to what's going on elsewhere in Cairo. So those who are using violence in Sinai are mainly based on Bedouin networks, acting against the state for their own historical reasons. Then the resonance of their friends against Egypt as Egypt not applying Islamic law and so on is not essentially what the conflict is about. The conflict is mostly a local conflict unrelated to what's going on elsewhere. Then what has been quite important for the past few months was the conflict in Syria. So the conflict in Syria emerged in 2011, progressively militarized, and progressively we've witnessed the emergence of many militant groups in Syria. So first of all, how people mobilized in Egypt. First, people from the Syrian opposition organized their own very small demonstrations with a handful of people because they were quite suspicious. They were suspicious about the potential involvement of the Syrian secret services in Egypt itself and so on. Then later on, some young Egyptian Salafis joined them, and then the demonstration became much bigger and bigger. And then they expanded their influence, and then thousands and thousands of mainly young Egyptian Salafis participated in those demonstrations, first against the Syrian embassies, against the Russian and Iranian embassies, and Iranian embassies. Then it became bigger, and then the connection between those Egyptians and those Syrians helped some of the Egyptians to actually reach Syria and be mobilized in specific networks so as to go and fight in Syria. And those were based on mainly on individuals. Even if those had ideas about why they would join one particular group here and there because they adopt their ideological positions, usually they would join some groups because they know individuals related to them. So now we're going to see, to conclude, the four main implications of Egypt as a case study and of this study in general. So first will be on violence and democracy, then on ideology of violence, then on the impact of the Syrian war now and in the future, and finally about the potential risks that still remain in Egypt. So first, what's been really interesting is that those two groups, so the Islamic group and the Jihad group, still have the same ideas that they hold before. They still believe in jihad as armed struggle, they still believe in Islamic law in the country. Nevertheless, their practice has totally changed. So it means that even if they agree about the same objectives as before, the translation in reality of those ideas in the political practice has actually strongly evolved. And what does that mean? That means that there's been a really long-lasting debate among academics on de-radicalization, saying that some groups were radical before and that somehow they could radicalize and reject their ideas. But what these two examples prove is that what's important is not renouncing ideas, it's mostly about political participation. Because it means that those groups, even if they still believe in the same ideas, under some circumstances, informed by macro factors, so political inclusion, absence of repression, and so on, can actually change the way they interpret their reality. So they would still hold the same ideas, but their political practices will change. And so it was partly the case of the Islamic group. For example, from the beginning, they created the political parties, was according to them, the political platform was based on we're going to impose Islamic law in the country. But then, when they realized that in order to do so, they need a consensus in the Egyptian society, they need to agglomerate a lot of Egyptians who didn't agree with them on the political program, they accepted that in practice, their choices were to be informed by them. And then ideologies of violence, so people who prone violence still exist in Egypt, but nevertheless, because of the change in the macro society in Egypt, so the absence of repression and the political inclusion, they are not calling for violence in Egypt itself. So that has influenced their ideas, even if they have not rejected them. Then to finish, the main issue is the Syrian conflict. Because what happened can be quite similar to what happened in Afghanistan by the late 80s, beginning of the 90s. So many people would go to Syria without being actually, without belonging to any particular militant group, but then similarly to what happened in Afghanistan, this conflict was accepted and was encouraged to a large extent. What happened in Afghanistan by 92, many of those who went to Afghanistan to fight, then were rejected and treated as security threats or as a security issue rather than thinking about their inclusion in society. So many people after that would join some militant groups, because there was an absence of alternative to them. So there was an absence of alternative. They knew that if they would to go back to their countries, they would be arrested and face repression. And so something similar would have to be applied in the Egyptian case, in the sense that those people who are there in Syria would have to be reintegrated in society rather than being considered only as a security threat. Yeah, just finished. And okay.
Sorry, we asked finished. Okay, lastly, we'll do your
I'm sorry, I'm going to be boring you with more talk about the Muslims and Islamists and bearded men and their Roman politics in Egypt. But I'm privileged for having the first-hand experience because I'm coming from Egypt at the American University there, where I'm doing my master's in Middle Eastern Studies. My name is Hend, and my presentation is going to be called Civil Society in the Arab World, Case Study of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Basically, my argument is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt since the 1920s have formulated the main and foremost, most important civil society organization, which is a non-formal organization, a non-official civil society organization. However, it had the most prominent role in mobilizing people and engaging them in carrying their revolution in 2011. Do I have this one?
It's connected to the projector and it doesn't. Have you ever connected this to a projector before?
Yes, back in
Oh, really? Is
It's not working.
Not at all.
I can go without it. It's okay.
Sorry?
I'll just continue until hopefully it works. It's got some interesting photos. So, I started my paper by, let me just state the obvious, that I used the civil society definition by Hegel, which is the intermediary body between state and family. And this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about basically, and this is what I think the Muslim Brotherhood is representing in Egypt since 1920s. After this definition, I moved on. Actually, what intrigued me most to write this paper is, or to do this research about civil society in Egypt, is two things. Number one, no, that's not mine. The things that intrigued me most to do this research is the importance of civil society and the rhetoric about civil society and transitions to democracy. Yes, please go on. Transitions to democracy. Like, for instance, according to Professor Philip Schmitter, civil society has, civil society has an inevitable role in transitions to democracy. So, go on. So transitions to democracy is not the only barometer to civil society is not the only barometer to transitions to democracy. We have also the voting polls and so on. And the second thing that intrigued me to write about this is the Orientalist discourse that there has never been, or there hasn't been much of civil society in the Arab world, like Daniel Pipes and Samuel Huntington and professors like those, who they always repeated this discourse that civil society hasn't been authentically existent in the Arab world due to the nature of the tribal nature of Arab society and maybe the Islamic structure also of these societies. Move on. My argument is there is more to civil society than NGOs. Like Professor Shalom Benoit says, there is more to civil society than NGOs, and the developmental approach, which imagines that the key to progress is when donors, the UN, or rich countries give aid to boost the non-state actors. So actually, when I started my research, I found that there has been civil society in the Arab world since the 19th century, since the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't necessarily in the form of US aid or this kind of formal organizations, but it came in forms of guilds, endowment, charity works, and so on. After this, it appeared in the early 19th century by the outburst of nationalism, and it was definitely influenced by its European counterpart in all over Europe. And then in the European colonialism period, civil society appeared like resistance groups, women's rights groups. After this, in the post-colonial era, we had organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, which basically appeared here in between the European colonialism and the post-colonial era. It first appeared as just charity and economic a charity organization, and afterwards it had more of a political identity. And then the 1980s and civil society organizations that erupted during the authoritarian regimes in order to fill the space that these failed systems left and to make some sort of pseudo-democracy or a pseudo-social space. This is Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1929. So nowadays, or actually I'm focusing on the period of Mubarak regime, which had civil society basically divided into two sectors, the Islamic-based groups and non-religious groups. I can't go without mentioning the liberal or the non-religious civil society groups like 6th of April, Kifaya. Those are some of the civil society groups that had inevitable role in intriguing the first sparks of revolution in Egypt. However, aside from these couple of groups, most of the other civil society organizations in Egypt were West-funded. And these Western-funded NGOs had some problems like being politicized. Like, according to Dr. Schmitter again, democracy is an indigenous process. You can't, you see so many countries promoting democracy, but they never do something really serious in order to achieve it, like in Egypt, for instance. So these groups are politicized. There's also the government bureaucracy that makes it extremely difficult for them to operate in a healthy environment. Most of the time, these kind of groups are ignorant about the hosting country's culture, so they don't really interact with the common people. They have their own elite fans that support them. So, for instance, according to Gallup, there was the question, do you favor or oppose the U.S. sending economic aid to Egypt? And as you see, between 2011 and 2012, those who were in favor of the U.S. sending economic aid to Egypt were like 15% by 2012, and those who opposed rose to 82% by 2012. So you can see that people in the street are not with this kind of Western-funded organizations. That this doesn't really reflect the civil society of Egypt, the society of the Egyptians. Go on. For instance, this is a picture that was taken during the revolution. It says, yes, Egyptian democracy, no US hypocrisy. So the Society of the Muslim Brotherhood, according to this argument, it says that it has achieved a gradual long-term transformation in the society. Or what is called, or I think it reflects what Anthony Gramsci has coined the term of the passive revolution. This passive revolution is transformation from within the society, which is different from networks of privilege that Stephen Hayden coined before. This kind of passive revolution comes in forms of changing the society from within through charity, affecting the society through media. They had their own media. They had their own newsletters and newspapers. What else? They were into the syndicates. They led all the syndicates, the union syndicates and labor syndicates in Egypt during the period of 1980s and 1990s until they were also into political activity, even during the very oppressive regime of Mubarak. During 2005, they were the only political group that joined in the revolution, in the elections, for instance. So, Anthony Gramsci. They started actually their political engagement through 1930s, and it goes without saying that this is not inclusive of all Islamist groups. So talking about the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't mean necessarily that all Islamic groups or all those involved into political Islam are necessarily taking the same trend. We have, like my colleague spoke about, we have the very radical wing and those who support the means of violence, using means of violence. And again, I highlighted the point that they were used by the Mubarak regime in some way to form something like a quasi-democracy, or to show the world that we're giving some social space and we're offering some agency. Today, the whole case is different. Of course, they're into power. They're on power, and they came to power after the 2011 revolution. I just want to highlight that people question now if they had taken over the revolution, and that's not true. They have actually come due to this passive revolution that they created before. But the civil society in Egypt now is suffering from severe polarity, and that was already enrooted in the society before, during the Mubarak era, and he was enjoying this because it's made the opposition very fragmented and fragile. And there is some sort of mismanagement because they were supposed to have more inclusive and tolerant and inclusive means of leadership, but that's not the case. While on the other hand, the secular opposition and the secular bodies of the civil society are not doing any better in being cohesive or in doing their job as serious opposition. So that's the case now, and I hope that this idea of passive revolution can help us more understand the role of informal organizations in creating social mobilization and mobilizing people on the long run. So that's all.
Due to the technical issues we had earlier, we're just going to have 20 minutes for questions, and we'll go ahead and go right into the question and answer session. With each question, the presenters will be given 3 minutes to respond. So we'll go ahead and start with questions in the back.
Yeah, thanks. My question is to the two presenters that discussed Egypt. In terms of civil society and violence, recent months, we had the whole kind of fiasco with the Constitution and backtracking from that, and then we had, obviously there were deeper issues, but you could say those soccer-related riots and the responses to that, which almost shut down Egyptian society for a very small period of time, but almost shut down. And I'm just wondering how you see that fitting into your larger presentations. I imagine you guys prepared these a little bit of a while ago, so if you could maybe add that as a postscript.
Okay, actually, I was about to mention that element by the end of my presentation, but then because of lack of time, couldn't. But basically, because there is an issue here. Because what I wanted to say is that the two groups do reject violence right now under the current conditions. But lately, by the end of by December, when there was some clashes around the presidential palace, and when some opposition movement used violence against the presidency, and when others also from the presidency use violence against them, some people who were in militant groups before said that if the opposition is using violence, then we can use violence as well. So it means that even if they reject violence under the current conditions, under some kind of democratic regime, the current deadlock can actually lead to using violence, even by these groups.
I think we both wrote the question.
Does that answer your question?
Sure.
Okay. Go ahead.
My question is for the next panelist. I know in the past, in various nations in Latin America, aid from Western nations, specifically, the U.S., say U.S. aid, more specifically, can use to kind of undermine, democratic or socialist movements. Do you see any, evidence kind of pointing towards that, maybe in Egypt or other nations that are kind of doing, democratic movements currently?
I wouldn't say they necessarily undermine transitions to democracy or undermine social movements, but they wouldn't really play a serious role in solving the issue or in pushing towards a more democratic society. They would just be there to fill the space, to fill the vacuum, and offer some sort of pseudo social engagement, while in reality that's not the issue. They're just there for, they're just serving certain interests, and they're not contributing much to mobilize the social masses or improve the state of the social society in the country.
May I ask what you think is the role of the military and the role of the judicial system in Egypt with respect to the evolution of democracy?
Can you repeat the question again? She didn't hear you.
I'm curious, in the evolution of democracy in Egypt, what is the role of the military, and what is the role of the Supreme Court and the judicial system that's presently in power?
So the military in Egypt was particularly neutral, or it seemed to be so at the very beginning, and fortunately we didn't have a divided military body like the case in Syria, and that's at least until now. We never know what's going to happen afterwards. But it seemed to be a neutral body. It stood by the side of the demonstrators at a certain point, and it didn't, however, interfere bluntly by supporting either side. So, and then there was a transition from there was a transitional period from the military rule to the elected presidency now, and that was already over, and we're done with it. So the military isn't really as active explicitly as in the case of Syria, for instance, in Egypt.
Can I just say something?
Go ahead.
Particularly in terms of the judiciary, which seemed to me was used at a certain point to try to undermine the elections that took place. There's a precedent in the Weimar Republic. I'm not sure if you guys go back that far, but after the First World War, when the Kaiser abdicated and you had the creation of a democratic government in Germany, one of the things the Weimar Republic did not do is purge the officer corps and the judiciary. So you had essentially a court system that was loyal to a regime that had been displaced and hostile to the new regime. It's really, I think that Morsi was able to make a change in the military leadership after the Sinai problem, but he hasn't yet been able to purge the judiciary. And it's my feeling that the future stability of the Egyptian experiment will necessitate a change in the judiciary from its present, constituency.
Go ahead, sir.
One thing common to the countries right now in the Middle East and the MENA country, they are falling. Yeah, they are dictators, but they are secular. Christians used to feel secure only in two countries in the Middle East, Syria and Iraq. Because of their own background, Saddam, he was in minority, Sunni was minority there, the Alawite was minority. That's why they are secular. Same thing was in Libya. He was a brutal dictator, but he was against the Islamic fundamentalists. So those countries are going down because of Saudi Arabia is funding other countries. But on the other hand, for example, in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia said it's true to fight the Shia. So one thing we are watching that secular dictators are going down, but not the Islamic fundamentalists countries. So what is
Someone want to respond?
What's the question?
Do you have a
question is, right now the regime that has failed, where secular dictators, brutal dictators, but not Islamic fundamentalist countries like Saudi Arabia or even in Kuwait, there's a monarchy. And there was election, Islamic fundamentalists won the elections in the parliament. They are not going down these countries. We do not see try for democracy on those countries. They are trying only in secular democratic dictators.
So are you asking why
Yeah.
okay, he's asking why the Islamist dictators are not going down while the
Should ask their
secular.
people, probably. Should ask Saudis.
Because they are structurally different, those countries, because they are not based on the same social contract. Those republics were based on an official social contract that would redistribute it to the global population, but then they just redistribute the wealth to their families and so on. And so it's mostly about the types of regime, but that doesn't mean that in those countries there are not social uprisings or social unrest. We've seen unrest in Kuwait. There were some changes in Saudi Arabia, and people start complaining in Dubai, in the Emirates in general. So we cannot just say that it won't lead to anything else. But then, just one remark, I don't really like the fact that we say that those countries are protecting minorities. They are not protecting minorities. Saddam was not protecting the Christians, like Syria is not protecting the minorities. They were not, they've never been like that. They've just used minorities to divide the societies, to divide and rule. So we cannot just say we have to accept those dictatorships, because the price to pay was an oppression of the majority. And so it doesn't mean rights of minorities have to be protected in the future, of course, but we cannot just say, oh, it was better before. Because the price to pay was oppression for decades. I don't think it's acceptable.
I would like to add a point that also look at the international reaction to these uprisings in countries like Bahrain or Kuwait, which are totally ignored or somehow undermined by international media, which means that it's all a part of a political game and they're not necessarily protecting minorities, but their revolutions are kind of neglected.
Yes, I have a question for Ms. Eltaweel. Firstly, you've enlightened me on your thesis that the Muslim Brotherhood is by definition in history a civil society, which is great. And in America's perspective from State Department, we don't say we shift, but we evolve our thinking in the 70s around the world. It was anti-communism, and for a short period in the 80s it was privatization, and now civil society and nation building are kind of intertwined. But so the question would be, as an American, for our State Department, from your perspective, my view is you would convince me to back the Muslim Brotherhood, at least from our U.S. AID perspective. But they are the biggest force and the one that has the best long-term potential. But with the change, I guess, of Section 2 of the Constitution and the way it was shifted, would you subscribe to, if it's possible, to rewind history a bit, or at least address that, to go back to addressing the Constitution so that our government could go back to more normalized relations that we've had in Somalia?
Maybe I should readdress this point because I think this is kind of simplistic approach of looking at it. Whether backing the U.S. aid should back it or not, that's not the main issue of my paper. My discussion was whether the Muslim Brotherhood really had Egyptian presentation in the street or not, or did he really reflect the Egyptian mainstream or the way of thinking of the common Egyptian people or not during the Mubarak era. So I didn't quite tackle this issue of whether it needs to be backed by the U.S.
But that's not your question. Your question is...
You actually, as an American,
Right.
with our foreign aid, and so maybe that should be, anybody else on the panel, should we really revisit the importance of the Muslim Brotherhood? In fact, right after the revolution, there was, through the media anyway, there was a lot of support that really they can be benign and very supportive and broadly based in the country.
I think yes, of course, at least on a governmental basis, it's now an elected government, and even if the U.S. government doesn't like it, it's there and it's elected, and people have chosen whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very important that the U.S. government understand that if you have relatively free and fair elections in almost any Muslim country, you are going to get a Muslim-oriented government, okay? And under the present circumstances, that government will have a pretty good, if it's a popularly based government, have a pretty good chance of being not too well or friendly to the United States because of those certain past history. So I think that it's my experience that at least if you work through to the middle echelons of the State Department and the middle echelons of most of the intelligence agencies, they know it. They know this, okay? Its problem is that when you get up higher and you have to then start advising in ways that conform to certain political parameters, the message gets lost. And that, for us, for our country, that's an issue.
I should add as well that in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, like in the case of many Islamist groups from the moderate to the radicals, we should not consider them as a black box. It's always composed of different factions, different tendencies. And so it means governments have to stand by principles, because, for example, if you have some more prone to democracy and some other opposed to those visions, for example, who is going to prevail at the end of the day? If we do oppose them, it's going to favor the radicals, like what happened with Hamas in Palestine, for example. Some of Hamas accepted democracy, some of them refused it for radical reasons, for example. Those who accepted democracy prevailed in the organizations, they participated to the elections, and then after the boycott, what would the radicals say? We believed in you, we supported you, we trusted you, now you failed, so now you have to follow us. And that's something similar that's going to happen again and again. So it's about supporting principles rather than organizations, you know.
We have one last question. Go ahead.
So I have a question to all of you. I'm worried because I think the debate should be about, so how well can the Muslim Brotherhood deal with the current problems in Egypt concerning economic situation, social situation, institution building, and so forth. I think that should be I think in the West we are too preoccupied with the actual nature of, ideological nature of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think the debate should be about how well can they actually govern, how well can they actually deal with the situation. I'm kind of wondering if what the debate looks like in Egypt. Is there a debate about that, or is the debate also about the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood? That's kind of my concern.
I would say that the opposition should exactly look at it the way you look at it. I mean, until the moment I see that the opposition is still too fanatic by and fascinated by the idea of ideological differences, and they're not willing to cooperate with the Brotherhood on the basis of the Egyptian interest. They're still putting the ideological differences as a boundary between them and the government. So there is a burden on the government as well as the opposition in order to resolve this and try to sort out ways in order to really go into the right track.
Because the legitimacy is kind of an erosion of, I mean, at least that's kind of what the reporting says in the West, certainly, through New York Times and stuff. In a sense, that's kind of the impression you get, in a sense.
Yeah.
So,
So the other two, you want to respond really quickly?
Yeah, I think in the long run, you put your finger on it, okay? So whoever is ruling in these countries, if you are going to remain, if the format is going to remain democratic, you have to go back and answer for your policies. And what people want, basically, is not just Sharia law, but they want an increase in their standard of livings. All right, and that is an enormous problem because Egypt exists, as all we do, exists in an international market, and it's got relatively limited resources. And so how do you work yourself out of that hole? It's interesting, according to Ahmadinejad, when, he looks at the sanctions and he says, whoa, what a great opportunity for self-sufficiency. All right? Well, maybe yes, maybe no, but that's his approach. But the Egyptians don't have that quasi opportunity for self-sufficiency. It's a very serious problem, and I don't know. I wouldn't bet on the odds.